On behalf of Mary Bono and I, we welcome you here. We're going to go around the room and introduce ourselves, and we thank the folks from the Boston Globe for coming here and getting us to focus on not only the problems but the solutions to problems that our country faces, our government faces. It's kind of an auspicious day with the Senate, I think, voting today to approve this budget agreement. But at the same time, those problems seem to be afflicting us for some time to come in terms of how our system works and doesn't work. So I'm Dan Glickman. I'm, among other things, I'm here at the Aspen Institute where I run the Congressional program, and also at the Bipartisan Policy Center where I'm a senior fellow. And these issues are high priority for us. And I would say at the Bipartisan Policy Center we have an initiative called Commission on Political Reform, where we're looking at these issues structurally with a group of people to come up with answers to these things. So the series that the Boston Globe has run is particularly important to us. And then I'll turn it to my colleague, Mary.
Thank you, Dan, and good morning, almost afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Dan for calling me to participate in this event. Dan and I've been friends for a long, long, long time, and it's a good example of bipartisanship, I think. So it's a pleasure to be here with him. Appreciate what the Boston Globe has done. I'd like to say that having been just through a bruising election where I lost, sometimes I'm reading what you wrote and thinking this is sort of like somebody describing a very slow train wreck you're going through and reliving it as you've written it. So I think the problems are real. I don't know from a historical perspective how different today's problems are from years prior, but I do know that they're very acute, and I think that our constituencies, and as a member of Congress, our constituencies felt both ways. They were happy to have gridlock and dysfunction at times, and at other times they're pretty angry and up in arms. So hopeful that we can kick this around a bit, learn some ideas, and get some ideas back to the Hill, hopefully, on how to get beyond this gridlock. And also want to say it's a pleasure to see my former colleague, Martin Frost. Nice to see you. So again, thank you, Dan, for having me.
You're welcome. So why don't we just quickly go around the room, except for the Globe folks, because they're going to speak to us, and maybe everybody can quickly introduce themselves and from where they're associated. There's a fellow who knows something about this subject right here, first guy.
I'm Norm Ornstein.
And Martin, you were a member from 1978 to 2004. And if everybody push the button when they.
I'm Devin McCarthy at Fairvote.
Fernando Batista. I'm independent. I used to be a world banker and a rock and roll accountant.
Excuse me, I'm Dennis Fitzgibbons. I'm a partner from TCH Group, but probably, excuse me, I'm probably here more because I spent about 20 years at the House Energy and Commerce Committee, most recently as the staff director for John Dingell.
As a doppelganger for Jason Stern, the president of Braddock Communications, who will be here shortly. And I'm Alan Schliefer, the president of the Wharton School Club and the chairman of our Innovation Summit at the end of April.
Hi, well, I too am a groupie of Dan Glickman, but I'm also involved with a fiction program called the Penn Faulkner Award for fiction with an outreach program for public schools in the District of Columbia.
And I'm Willie's husband. I'm also, along with Ornstein, we're members of the Minnesota Mafia. I'm here with Congressional Quarterly.
Great. Just introducing ourselves.
Yeah, Nancy Berg. I am formerly a program director at the Aspen Institute and also a former Minnesotan, and now am a national security person, and am also anyway, working on a number of different things, including a book on retirement.
Hi, my name is Tony Baker. I'm Congresswoman Elizabeth Estes' Let's Live director. She represents the 5th Congressional District in Connecticut.
I'm Andrew Rickey. I'm a director at Levick, which is a communications firm here in D.C., and I formerly worked on the Hill.
Hi, I'm Artie Mandel. I am legislative director for Congressman Bill Pascrell, representing the 9th Congressional District of New Jersey, Patterson and Bergen County.
Hi, I'm Curtis Gans. I'm director of the Center for the Study of the American Electorate that looks at voting behavior.
John Fortier, another Glickman groupie here, but also the director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Michael Stempler with the People's Advocate.
Cynthia Farrell Johnson, artist and also public affairs officer.
Jim Coyne, I guess the last groupie here for Dan Glickman. I'm a former one-term member of Congress. For 18 years, I ran the National Air Transportation Association, making sure Wichita got everything it needed in terms of aviation. But now I'm with the Cassidy Group in Washington.
Let's see, back there, everybody wants to,
Doug Fair, I work for Dan at the Aspens.
Anybody else want to say who you are?
I'm Laura Kranish. I'm a groupie of Michael Kranish.
Okay, 7-1.
Good. I'm David Devilcolts. I direct the planning and evaluation function here at the Aspen Institute. Stephen Carlson, I work for Mike Capelano.
Anybody else? Okay, well, saying that, it's a pleasure to have everybody here. And Chris, I think I will turn it over to you, and you can talk a little bit about the project as a whole, and I think you're going to turn it to Michael and everybody else. So why don't you proceed?
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Rowland. I'm Bureau Chief of the Boston Globe here in D.C. And we came up with this Broken City project. Our editor, Brian McGrory, who was recently named a former columnist and who took over the paper in January. And at his first lunch, he came down here and he said, we were just coming off a grueling 2012 election cycle, and we really wanted to have 13 provide us an opportunity to step back and do something a little more deep and really take a look at what was going on in Washington. And Brian came up with the concept of let's really step back and look at all the dysfunction in a way that's really for our readers, in a way taking somewhat of an outsider perspective. I mean, so much of the incremental news here kind of almost takes it for granted that there's all this broken down dysfunction. And what if we take some deep dives and really tell some narratives? And it was a wonderful assignment. We immediately convened and began a process of brainstorming with our reporters. We have a bureau of 6 people here, which, by the way, is sort of one of the last of the Mohicans of a regional newspaper with a standalone bureau. Most are in chain bureaus and that sort of thing, or if it's a standalone bureau, it maybe only has 1 or 2 people. We're very lucky to have this size and caliber of a team. Off of people's beats, what do you think is the aspects of broken Washington that our readers back home really need to know about? So it became a very organic process of brainstorming. We did long takes, 2-month hits, as well as some things such as the Farm Bill. We broke off as quick dailies when the Farm Bill failed back in August. That was a pretty good example of a broken city story. So it was we had a lot of variety, and so I think what we'll do is we'll each go around very quickly and just say what kind of chunks we broke off, and then I think we'll turn it over to Michael Kranish, the Deputy Bureau Chief, who spearheaded the last phase of our project, which was solutions. We didn't want to just be completely negative about Washington, although perhaps it was justified, but really forward-looking too. Actually, we did hear from some readers and some guests to the Bureau a few times that, well, you're talking about everything that's broken and wrong. What can be done? So for the last installment that came out a couple weeks ago, Michael spearheaded the solutions piece, which a number of people contributed, and you'll hear more about that. So for my little piece, I did 3 stories in the series, focusing on some of the things that I find interesting, such as lobbying and fundraising. I did a story about the lucrative return on investment on tax lobbying for corporations. I did something on the hopelessly gridlocked FEC, which many of you know is gridlocked by design, and also about how one example of why climate change legislation is consistently blocked and why so many people in Congress don't believe that climate change is an issue that needs to be addressed. So if we maybe go down, starting with Brian, we'll buzz down quickly, that short, just say what stories you did, and then we'll turn it over to Michael Kranish to talk about the solutions. Brian?
Thank you, Chris. I'm Brian Bender. I'm the national security reporter, and I focused really on the ideas industry. And this is the perfect place, obviously, to talk about it, but think tanks, the growth of think tanks in the last few decades, but particularly focused on how some of the most influential ones have become quite partisan and often just voices for either the left or the right, adding to this cacophony of conflict, disagreement, and opposing facts. And so I'd say the most interesting phenomenon that we detailed was this phenomenon in which think tanks have become so partisan that they've actually run the risk of running afoul of their IRS tax-exempt status and have created these 501c4s. It's sort of a shadow organization. Heritage Action for America is one. The Center for American Progress on the other side has its own. And so that was the focus of my work. And I'll pass it to Matt.
Thank you for having us. This is an honor to be here. My name is Matt Visor. I covered Congress in the 2012 presidential campaign, and now I'm covering the White House and national politics. The first story that I did, which was the first of the series, was in March on judicial vacancies and how the court system is bogged down because of the conflict over appointing people. And I've actually focused on the D.C. Circuit Court, which later led more recently to the nuclear option and getting rid of the filibuster because of that conflict. I also looked at a Tea Party district. I spent some time in the Kansas Big First, which is Tim Huelscamp's district, looking at the conflict there. People who are very excited about what Tim Huelskamp is doing, which is coming to Washington and voting no and not compromising on a lot of things. So I spent spent time with people in that district. Another piece I did looked at Rick Nolan. For the Minnesotans here, may be familiar with Rick Nolan, who had a 32-year gap between his terms in Congress. He served in the late 70s, went back to Minnesota, and ran again in 2012 and won. His staff calls him Rip Van Nolan because it's as if he took a nap for 32 years and woke up and did not recognize where he was. And the other piece I did was looking at Obama and the White House, and Obama, who ran on breaking down the red and blue divide in the country, and the ways in which he's been unable to do that, and in ways that we still remain broken. The only one Chris mentioned was the Farm Bill, looking at that. And then the last one with the solutions piece, I went to California and wrote about their primary system and how they have a top two primary system, which is really not a party primary at all, but the top two vote getters advance to the general election. And it's a way in which they're trying to have a little bit more moderation in terms of the people that they select. And I can talk more about that later as we turn towards solutions.
Hi, my name is Tracy Jan, and I had the pleasure of seeking out freshman Congress members who were being targeted in tough races in this upcoming midterms, where from the get-go, even before they were sworn in, during orientation, they were already being attacked by the other side. So they were complaining about, mostly off the record or on background, complaining about the hours they have to spend in these phone banks just across the street from, in D-Trip or in the NRCC across the street from the House offices. Some of them sat in their cars and dial for donors. I moved from there to writing about Asheville, North Carolina, which is the perfect illustration of how partisan gerrymandering has contributed to gridlock. And from there, I wrote about the emergence of No Labels, which is supposed to be a bipartisan group that is looking forward to some sort of solutions building. And we can talk more about whether that's working later on. Oh, I also went to Des Moines, Iowa, to write about their nonpartisan redistricting process, which works very well in Iowa, some say, because they're so nice over there.
Hi, I'm Noah Bierman. For all you Minnesotans out there, I started at the Duluth News-Tribune. But I wrote about an example of what Chris was talking about, some stories we wrote actually off the news. And one of those was what were those 1,000 questions given by one member of the Senate to Gina McCarthy before she could be confirmed as EPA administrator? And how did we get to the point where she had to answer 1,000 written questions about a variety of issues, some of which might be pretty surprising and completely unprecedented in this process. I also wrote about the existential struggle faced by John Boehner in the midst of the shutdown. That was also off the news, but tried to go a little bit further into depth about Boehner's very difficult choices and whether or not he is the person to best lead in this moment. And then I also wrote about the efforts that Democrats have made and are planning to make in the midterms to help the Tea Party, because they feel that helps them in this sort of winner-take-all situation that we're in to maintain a majority, and that's what it's all about, despite what costs it may have for both sides to actually govern.
Okay, and Michael, before you begin, I want to recognize Walter Isaacson, the president of the Aspen Institute, and Senator Byron Dorgan from North Dakota.
I just wanted to come listen in because this is the most important thing we could be talking about, and the senator and I work. The senator runs a program here at the Institute on Native American youth, but it does get back to everything that's sequestration and everything else. You want to say something?
Well, nice to see all of you. Dan told me a little bit about what you're doing, and you're the first person I've heard say Duluth. They usually say Duluth. It's the Scandinavians up there.
Yeah, I'm from Florida.
You betcha, Byron. Sure, you bet. Anyway, it's interesting to listen to.
Well, they've all written various stories over the last year looking at various aspects of the problems, and it's just a big, how many stories total?
I think 19.
19 stories over the last year, and now Michael is going to talk a little bit about the solution side of the picture.
Right. Okay, thanks for having us. It's really great to be here. Aspen Institute does some wonderful work, and I had the chance last year to participate with some Aspen Institute seminars and was really impressed and really excited that we could do this here. I'm Michael Kranish. I'm the Washington Bureau Deputy Chief. And as was just mentioned, this was a 19-part series that ran over the course of the year. And I wrote several of the stories in the series. The first one was a story about Bob Dole. I had covered Congress back in 1990 when Bob Dole put through the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was a story about his efforts to help on pushing through a treaty based on that act. And it was what we tried to do throughout the series, and to use narrative writing to tell what was going on in Washington in ways you probably didn't realize. People know Washington's broken, dysfunctional, gridlocked, et cetera. And sort of the overriding idea behind the series was to use narrative writing in almost all of the pieces to tell really interesting stories sort of behind the scenes about what was going on and why things were broken. And I could talk more about that particular story if you like later, but long story short, the treaty failed, even a non-controversial treaty which seemed to be smoothly going its way, but it was sort of a forerunner of what happened later with other fiscal bills. I also wrote about the partisan media, and I wrote about what we called an industry of distortion that exists here in Washington. Now, the last part of this series, which ran a couple of weeks ago, let me mention before I forget, if you want to read the whole series, it is available on the Globe's website, bostonglobe.com, to subscribers, and also you can get it. It was just updated a few days ago as an ebook, which is available on Amazon, et cetera. So those who may be watching it online, you can go and read the entire series there as well. So the last part was a series of stories which ran on one day, 4 pages in the Sunday paper, all about solutions. What can be done to fix all these problems that we spent the year writing about? So we sent reporters various places. Matt Visor went to California, as he mentioned, to write about the open primary system. Tracy Jan went to Iowa to write about the analog of the story she wrote earlier in the year, which was about how partisanship was used. I'll let her talk about the 2 stories on redistricting, so you can talk about that in a second. And then Noah Bierman went to Connecticut to write about money and what can be done in an example of corralling what seems to be the unlimited money in politics. Overall, what we found in writing about solutions is that there are many, many solutions out there. It's not that there's no idea as to how to fix things. Clearly, things are broken. State by state, you can find states doing things that clearly improve what we call basically small d, the more democratic representation of Congress. The overarching problem we found, and many people have written about some of this, is that Congress, in '82, the vast majority of members of Congress were considered in the middle. National Journal did an interesting study where they said 300 and some odd members in '82 would have been considered overlapping. In other words, there were Democrats who were more like Republicans, Republicans more like Democrats, and they all sort of fit together, which is why there was much more bipartisanship. Fast forward to 2012, and the number of people considered in the middle in the U.S. House was 13. So you can very dramatically see with those 2 numbers over those years why we have such incredible partisanship. Basically, there's not a lot to be gained if you want to win re-election for a lot of members if you are trying to make compromises. That's what we've seen, except with the last very small exception of this small budget deal, which really doesn't solve the big problems, but lets them get on to the next phase, where a lot of the problems will certainly reemerge. So what we looked at were solutions that say, how do you get a more representative democracy? Because the problem seems to be is that while Congress is way at the extremes, if you look at almost every poll, the majority of Americans are basically centrists. A poll after poll will show you, one recent poll said 51% of Americans call themselves centrists. So you have a Congress way out here, and you have the public who's really more where Congress used to be, in the middle. So we looked at that, and there are a number of things being done. I'll let each reporter who wrote the solution story talk about that. For my sidebar in the solutions piece, every political scientist you talk to will say, you know, when other countries implement democracy, they typically do it different than the United States does. They will do, oftentimes, it's more of a parliamentary system, for example, so that when there's an election and the majority of people vote a certain way, that then the government will follow through on what the majority of people wanted. It's pretty unique in a democracy to have our system, which was set up in response to the way the parliament worked, obviously going back to the revolution, that we have a system in which you can have an election that people can vote overwhelmingly for one party, and yet because of the way the rules are set up, separation of powers, filibusters, on and on, that you can have a situation where there's gridlock. So if you look at many different kinds of parliamentary systems, basically they have carte blanche. The one party wins, or there's a coalition that's assembled, and then they can push through their program. If people don't like that, then the entire system is thrown out, or they can be a call for new elections. So the way we implement democracy here in the United States, obviously, is not the only way democracy is implemented. Many other countries do it differently. They have their own set of problems, which if their reporters were here, they would tell you about. But, for example, obviously in England, if there is an election, the agenda of that winning government or winning party or winning coalition is put through. For better or worse, it is put through. They don't have debt ceiling debates. If there's a measure, it's pretty much guaranteed passage with some exceptions. Certainly there's some exceptions. But it works entirely differently than what we have here. So with that, I wanted the other reporters who wrote about the solutions piece to talk about specifically their solutions, and then we'll throw it out for all sorts of back and forth. We have a good amount of time to do that. So why don't we start with Noah and talk about what you found about money in politics.
Okay, I'll be brief because my solution lasted only temporarily that I found. In Connecticut, they wanted to have what they call clean elections, and they actually had a bipartisan solution after their governor went to jail on corruption charges. It led to a lot of initiatives to try and do things differently. And they did implement a public financing, which a number of states and localities have done, but it's still a pretty rare thing to do. I know New York City has it at the local level, and the key to some of these public matching systems and why Connecticut's has worked to some extent is that they're pretty generous in how much the public matching is, and that really helps people from spending the long hours in the phone booth across the street to have to dial for dollars constantly. And they also passed a number of laws which significantly limited how much the lobbying industry could be involved in fundraising on behalf of candidates and donating directly to them. A lot of that has since been struck down by court rulings, which brings, and then the legislature, in response to the court rulings, changed the bipartisan nature. It's become much more of something that Democrats support and Republicans oppose, where it wasn't that initially. But because of Democrats had made some changes that allowed for to loosen some of the requirements that Republicans felt benefited the Democratic Party and that they were abusing their position in power, it has disintegrated somewhat. But the core of the idea did work in many ways to help people who were not heavily invested in the system to get elected and to have a chance, and it did force more incumbents there to take seriously the opposition and realize that they would have more competitive elections there. So to that extent, it has had some success.
Okay, Tracy, can you contrast what you found about redistricting in North Carolina versus Iowa?
Sure. So my solutions piece was I went to Iowa, where once every 10 years, for about 45 days, these 3 bureaucrats, nonpartisan men and women, gather in a windowless chamber across the street from the State House and draw up a map of what the new district will look like based on the new census numbers. And the only criteria they use is making sure that the population distribution is even, and also that the districts are as compact as possible. Contrasting that to North Carolina, which is a great example of how partisan gerrymandering has helped dilute the voice of, in Asheville, the Democrats in Asheville. Asheville is the most Democratic area in North Carolina. So what often happens in most states is when whatever party is in control, in this case Republicans, they hire outside consultants, pay them a lot. There's this guy who goes around, he's called the map maker, and they use very sophisticated computer programming to figure out how best to isolate the minority vote, the minority party vote, so the Democrats in North Carolina, and in that way they turned the congressional seats in for North Carolina to be majority Republican, even though the Democrats had won the majority of the votes. So those are the two main contrasts. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether the Iowa system will actually work in other states. Iowa is predominantly white people. The political tendencies are pretty evenly distributed through the state, with the exception of the upper left-hand corner of the state that is more Republican. But one person told me that if every place looked like Mayberry, they'd only need Andy Griffith as sheriff. So there is a question of whether that will work, but it is a start. And in Iowa, it's been working for 20 years. Both sides say there is no plan to change it.
Okay, the last person who wrote about the solutions was Matt Visor, and I think you mentioned it, but Matt, how many states are trying to do what California is doing with that open primary system, and what's been the impact so far?
So California implemented this system in 2010. They passed it in 2010 as part of a ballot referendum, pushed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was not getting much compromise in the California state legislature. So they passed a series of reforms, one that did redistricting somewhat similar to the way that Iowa does it. The other, which I focused on, changing the way that they do their party primaries, and I explained that a little bit before. So I focused on a race just outside of San Francisco, in a district, a very liberal district that Pete Stark had represented since 1972, and won easily every time. He won the Democratic primary. There was always a token Republican who'd run against him, but they really didn't stand a shot in this district. So under this new system, a guy named Eric Swalwell, who was 31 years old at the time, not even born when Pete Stark started representing that district, ran against Stark. He lost in the first round, but they were the top 2 vote getters. So Swalwell, for the general, targeted the Republicans in the district. There's 23% registered Republicans in this district, normally a non-factor, but he was knocking on Republican doors. He had Republicans endorsing him. Pete Stark was taking out ads criticizing him for that. There was one that had an image of Eric Swalwell in a teacup saying, "This is not our kind of tea, for this district," trying to brand Eric Swalwell as a Tea Party member, even though he's a Democrat. So Swalwell ended up winning and beating Pete Stark, who was, when I talked to him, kind of still amazed that this had happened. I mean, Pete Stark was endorsed from every Democrat you can imagine, from President Obama on down, and yet he still lost. And across the state, it seemed to work a little bit as designed, where there were 7 incumbents who lost in 2012. By comparison, all other years dating back to 2002, only 2 incumbents had lost in those elections. So it makes incumbents more vulnerable. It promotes more moderate candidates who reach out to the swath of the district. It's not perfect, and Fair Vote, for example, I think is promoting a different model that allows 4 people to advance. This is not driving up turnout in early elections. So the primaries have pretty high stakes because it's narrowing it down to the top 2 finalists, and yet you're not getting a broad swath of the electorate participating. Washington State also does this. Louisiana also does this, and those are sort of the states that are involved.
Okay, turning it back to Dan and Mary.
Yeah. Well, we have 4 former members here, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I'd say probably maybe overly generalizing, but categorizing us, we would all be in this 30 to 30 range, what I called generally the moderate groups. So I wonder, Mary, you might start. I wonder what thoughts you have with respect to what you heard, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. We'll go to Martin and Jim.
Thank you, Dan. I've had a lot of thoughts, and I guess it would be good of me to focus on the California conversation and to say that I think it's an experiment that we don't yet know how it's going to turn out. There are tremendous pitfalls, and I think the more famous race in California would be the Berman-Sherman race. And in my view, the better man didn't win that race. I actually endorsed Howard Berman. So as a Republican, I endorsed a Democrat against another Democrat, and this was an example of a Democrat courting Republican votes, yet it didn't work. And Howard had a lot of Republican support, but it backfired. So, we'll wait and see a little bit. But the notion of, like Tracy was saying, the redistricting being sent to an independent board, you said 3 bureaucrats. We went through this in California too, and after the referendum. And I can say that in California it was highly politicized, and people quickly learned how to game the system in California. We have a commission that went around the state listening to various governmental agencies, local agencies, listening to just citizens. But people quickly learned how to stack those meetings and how to influence the panel. So again, we'll have to wait and see how that all works out. I didn't lose because of either one of these. I lost to a Democrat in an increasingly Latino district. I think that, perhaps a better man, at least on, paper, may have won. But I don't yet know how these things are going to work out. But I think they're a great start. And other notes I was taking, we'll get through as you guys speak.
Okay, so let's,
thank you.
Martin. Martin was chairman of the House Democratic Campaign Committee, so he's skilled in the efforts that we've talked about.
My first comment will be to Noah because of that. Noah, the problem is you can do things on a state level that you can't do on a federal level. And the problem is the United States Supreme Court. And a chain of rulings in federal elections that money equals speech, and it's a free speech issue, and you can't put limits on what can be spent in a congressional race or a Senate race. And I think until either there's this massive public outcry or the Constitution is amended, that you can't solve the problem of money on the federal level right now. And a lot of interesting creative solutions have been tried. You're not going to have public financing. You can't get that through Congress. And you've not been able to devise a mandatory scheme. You can only have a voluntary scheme involving limits in which candidates agree to limits, but they're not required to. And, of course, that went by the board on the presidential level with both first George W. Bush and then Barack Obama ignoring the the presidential financing system, not agreeing to abide by the limits and being able to raise anything they want to. So you've got an enormous roadblock in changing the financing system for federal races, and it starts with the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, Noah, Matt, I would be very interested in, there's an issue that Dan Glickman and I have a unique interest in that is in Tim Huelskam's district. It's one of the largest new scientific research projects being contemplated and partially funded so far by the federal government. And so you now have a Tea Party congressman representing a district where there's a large new scientific research project that requires federal funding. Was he asked about that by his constituents as he traveled around, kind of squaring that circle?
No, I mean, and this may be a different one than you're talking about, but
I'm talking about NBAF at K-State. It's the largest new scientific research project, one of the largest that the country is undertaking.
This is maybe a different project, but as part of redistricting, they districted it out.
The answer is they drew it into Huelskam's district. They took it out of Lynn Jenkins' district and put it in Huelskam's district. So that project, which is seeking the significant amount of federal funding, is now represented by a Tea Party congressman who's not necessarily in favor of federal funding.
Yeah, and I don't know as much about that project specifically, but the areas that I was with him in were around Hutchison and Jetmore.
Now, this is a little finger of his district.
So it's
reached
probably
all
further
the way
away
over to pick up Manhattan, Kansas, where K-State is located.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. He has one of the highest federal spends for agriculture subsidies, and he is an advocate and somewhat articulate in this regard, but he's a vitriolic advocate against the farm programs. So we'll see how that circle is squared as time goes on. He is the district that Bob Dole represented in the Congress years ago. Jim?
Well, as you know, Dan, for the last 18 years I've been in the infrastructure and aviation world and have had the pleasure of visiting 1,000 airports across the country. And it gives you a perspective of all of the nooks and crannies in America and how different the political demography is. One of the things that I'm struck by is the fact that not only has Congress gotten hyper-partisan, but there's been a real change, I think, in the partisanship of the American electorate. And much of it, I mean, it's not overwhelming. It's not like it's, black and white in the electorate. But both of the wings of the party, the extreme wings on both sides, have gotten bigger, I believe. Both the extreme right component of the Republican Party and the extreme left component of the Democratic Party. And I asked myself, why is this? And I mean, of course, you mentioned it in one of your pieces about the media. And if I had to point out one dramatic difference, when I first came into Congress in 1980, you would go home and you'd watch 3 nightly news shows. And they were all centric. I mean, they were really maybe a little bit left of center, but pretty much in the middle. And the American public had a very different media consumption of extremism in those days than what it has today. And of course, far be it from me to ask the media industry to be critical of the media. And it's not so much, I mean, Philadelphia at the time had 2 newspapers, and both of them were pretty much in the middle. And I used to work for Time Magazine, and Time Magazine was kind of proud of being a moderate in the middle. So much of the media in the 60s, 70s was a very, very different reality. And I don't have to tell you what it's like today. It's just loud, and it really has fostered. And I mean, it's nice to think that the American electorate thinks for themselves on every issue. But I think the reality is that much of what they think is a function of what they've heard in recent media discussions. And if we want to blame Congress or Washington for this dysfunction, you got to move a step back and say, okay, why are these members of Congress behaving the way they are? They're not irrational people. They're behaving because their electorate wants them to behave that way. And the electorate has really changed. Okay, why has the electorate changed? Because I think the media that they are listening to in different ways is making them more extreme. And I don't know if there's a solution to that. I mean, we can exhume Walter Cronkite maybe, or maybe get an avatar of Walter Cronkite to come up on the TV screen every night and define, that's the way it is. But it's not the way it was when he was around. And
I think it has really polarized the American electorate in a way that very few people have a solution for. And I don't know what the solution is. To wait until Roger Ailes dies, or wait until MSNBC goes out of business. But it's really a major part of the equation in my mind.
So I think we want to open it up. I have just one thought, and I think it was something, Michael, you said, and then maybe you want to.
Well, I just wanted to, he alluded to a piece I wrote about the partisan media, so I just wanted to throw out a couple of facts from that story for the rest of people to digest. It's sort of, there's two things that I would say about that. Number one, it is a very different world. So to put some statistics on it, if you go back, again, I referenced earlier in '82, the difference in Congress, you go back to the same year roughly, there were about 52 million people watching one of the network broadcasts of the news. It was the only thing on, basically, let's say at the 6:30 hour, so it was just on and most people watched it. It certainly was the case in my household. And you go to today, the population of the country has dramatically increased. The number of outlets has incredibly increased. And yet the number of people who watch news at that same hour is about 22, 24 million people. About half as many as watched it when there were far fewer choices and fewer people in the country. Now, obviously, there's other outlets available. There's many other places to get information. The reality is, and the backbone of that story was, we've had an explosion of information, the greatest in the history of mankind, more availability of information than ever before, and yet fewer people perhaps being aware of that or getting a more independent view of it. And what you have is that while Fox News certainly is very important, I focused on that quite a bit in the story, of course, they may have 2 million viewers on a certain night, far fewer than the network broadcasts, but they are very passionate viewers, as are those who watch MSNBC, and they sort of become the activists who then tell other people about what's going on. Members of Congress tend to watch those channels oftentimes from their party, so they have a very outsized influence. But as far as information, hopefully this series was an effort, at very serious journalism to show here's how we can get information out in a way that was pretty unique, I think, and took up really a huge commitment of the newspaper. There's a lot of journalism like that by the major papers, our paper and the New York Times and the Washington Post and other outlets. So there's more information out there, really good information than ever. Whether people will go to that, it's we just hope to produce the best information that will draw people to those stories, and get people out of their silos of information. And that's what we can do in the media, is to say, well, we're just going to keep on keeping on, and we're going to provide that independent, information, and that people hopefully will continue to have that source, and hopefully this is an example of it.
So before, I would just make one comment. Those of you who have the energy to see a movie called Anchorman 2, and I'm not recommending it as a great piece of journalism, but it exploits this issue, and it basically takes place before there's a CNN and before any of this stuff happening, and how somebody gets the idea, why don't we do something that focuses on police chases in Los Angeles on the freeways? That would get a lot of viewers. And then they proceed to pursue the issue that way. The other thought I had with Michael, you mentioned something about, I think it was Michael, about the nature of the country, is that with all these other factors happening and whatever's causing them, chicken, the egg, and everything else, we have a political system that operates intentionally with one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. We have separation of powers, and nobody else really has that. And so that system really requires an exquisite degree of trust and compromise to get anything done. And that the system, the grease has been that system over the last, since the beginning of the Republic, has been trust and compromise, because without that, a system that's got one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator cannot work, as opposed to a parliamentary system where you can kind of push through your agenda. And so one of the interesting things I have on my mind is, does our system work with the kind of factors that are out there? And I've just raised that issue as something that we want to consider. But we'd like to keep this as a more solution-oriented, thoughts you think could help the system. So let's just open it up for any thoughts or comments that anybody may have. I know that Norm Ornstein is sitting over there, and he's written a lot about it.
Sure. Well, let me say a few things, just almost bullet points, Dan, that a lot of which are in the book that I did with Tom Mann called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. First, on the parliamentary system, the one piece of not so bad news is that we have growth if it's sluggish. The parliamentary democracies in Britain and the rest of Europe are foundering. So they've worked. They've implemented policies. they keep implementing stupid policies over and over again, that austerity in the face of sluggish economies. So they are not perfect. The problem that we have now is we have parliamentary parties in a system that won't allow them. And if you have, as we see now with the Republican Party and divided government, a parliamentary minority that unites to vote no on most things, you lead to a crisis. But I would also say it's broader than that, and it gets to the solutions area. What we suggest is it's not just polarization. You can actually find compromise with polarization. You can have people who are at distinctly different points of view, as Ryan and Murray would show, and yet do some trade-offs and find common ground. It's tribal, and that means we have a cultural problem. Tribalism is where you say, if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And when you had, even after the 2012 elections, in the immediate aftermath, Pat Toomey reflect on the failure of a background check bill, stripped down to something that 90% of Americans supported, failing on a filibuster, and he says, some of my colleagues weren't going to vote for anything that Barack Obama was for. That is the essence of tribalism, I think. And that's our great challenge. If this is a cultural problem, and the media, tribalism contributes to this, and Roger Ailes going away isn't going to change the reality that the Fox business model makes it a huge moneymaker. If Rush Limbaugh tomorrow said, can't we all just get along? We can work with this guy. 15 million pairs of ears would immediately go to Mark Levin or Laura Ingraham, and they would make all the money, and his income would drop like a rock. So that's where we reach a dilemma. Structural solutions are very hard to find for cultural problems. The problem with redistricting reform is that we have sorted ourselves out into like-minded areas. And the big problem is that if everybody did what Iowa did and you had compact districts, we would have more homogeneous echo chambers, not fewer. So you'd actually have to create more bizarre districts if you wanted to get heterogeneity back. One of the things that I found is a number of African American leaders have begun to reflect back on the South is a unique part of this problem. I think it's sort of removed from the rest of the country in many ways. That the Voting Rights Act, now you're starting to see maybe this hasn't worked quite the way we wanted, because what's happened is districts that used to have 15 or 20% African Americans now have 0%. And so you get members who have no reason, even no fiduciary reason, to listen to other voices. And it's added to what's really become, I think, even a more blatant racist tone out there in the society. So we've got to go beyond redistricting. The open primaries, if you combine them as Fair Vote would and as I would with preference voting, can make a real difference. And while the early political science research suggests it's not working terribly well, that's partly the tendency of political scientists to want to trash everything that looks like it might be a problem and show how we can tell you this won't help. The fact is, what we need to do is to create some barriers around members who get their heads out of the foxhole and are willing to compromise and immediately get hit with the $3 million target on their backs from Club for Growth or others. And if you have an open primary with preference voting, and if we get, this is not a structural solution, more examples where local business communities and others pony up money to protect people who are under attack, and maybe even fight fire with fire, go after some of those who are way off in at the extremes, then you're going to create an incentive for people to begin to move together a little bit more. We need to enlarge the electorate. That is, I think, the fundamental thing. And an open primary helps in that regard, but we also have to look at ways that make voting a lot easier. And whether it is weekend voting or a much better modernized registration system, the use of vote centers, things that make it easier for people to vote and not harder, and fighting the voter suppression efforts, that would help. And I just make one last point that reflects on something that Dan said. The structural elements inside Congress are often overstated. The problem with the filibuster was not the rule itself. The problem was a rule that kept things within boundaries for many decades, careened out of control when you had one party decide that the norms were just going to go right out the window and use it routinely as a weapon of mass obstruction and not on a small category of issues. That means you got to get reform to change it, but unfortunately you can create even more turmoil in the process of doing it. And there again, it's a matter of changing culture, but sometimes you have to change rules to change culture. And one final thing that I would do, I would love to change the schedule in Congress. 3 weeks on, 1 week off. The 3 weeks that they're here, 5 days a week, 9 a.m. Monday, 5 p.m. Friday. Incentives for members to move families to Washington, time for debate and deliberation, and no fundraising in the 15 days a month when they're in session. Got 15 days to do the fundraising, no more, I'm going to leave the committee hearing now because I got to go do call time, never mind going on the floor. Now, these are, you can't wave your magic wand and make them happen, but those are areas where we could begin to change culture.
Dan, could I ask Norm just one question? When you say preference voting, you mean first, second, and third choice. You don't need multi-member districts.
No, no. Although I must say, Tom Downey many years ago suggested that maybe we should change the House to have a little bit of the element of the German federal system, have some at-large members. And I would favor having some states with some at-large members. But otherwise, what I mean is, if you have a bunch of candidates running, you give preferences, and then you have a kind of an instant runoff. And remember, one of the things that happened the first go-around in California is you had a strongly Democratic district where you had 15 Democrats and 2 Republicans running. The Democrats all split the votes. The 2 Republicans became the candidates. And in the end, you had much more disenfranchisement because the only choice they had was 2 Republicans. You wouldn't have that happen if you had preference voting.
Yeah, but you were just a young kid then. I want to say to Noah, I didn't think anybody was crazy enough, except for me, to go to work in the Duluth, on the Duluth News Tribune, and you're from Florida?
Did you ever see Northern Exposure? You remember Fleischman?
Mm-hmm.
People thought I was him.
Well, I guess what I'd like to hear is a little bit, maybe from Chris or from Michael, about the media part of this. As they know, I'm a victim of one closure of a bureau, which I think was quite alike in many different ways, or in many ways, with the Boston Globe. We had 11 people. We did the investigation that led to the imprisonment of Duke Cunningham, and the way that thing worked, I think it's pretty clear that if our bureau had been closed a year or 2 years earlier, that Cunningham would still be selling earmarks out of his office with the on the Intelligence Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. So I just kind of look out at what you see emerging as these bureaus like the Copley Bureau and other bureaus fade. Is there a new model which is developing, and how do you explain your unique ability to do what you do in the face of the dwindling size of the media cohort in Washington? But what is there a model out there that you think is workable, that combines the new media and the old media, but the traditional disciplines that all of you are so familiar with in terms of editors and fact checkers and accountability and so on?
Thanks for the question. You were modest enough to mention that you won the Pulitzer Prize and then they closed your bureau, right? Which is especially shocking.
Mission accomplished.
So the first part of your question, I think, is a little easier to answer. What the new models are, I think, is still evolving. I'm not sure. But the reason that we have a 6-member bureau here in Washington really is because we've been lucky to have good ownership of our news organization. I should mention that Carolyn Ryan is here from the New York Times, who the new bureau chief, so she might have some good insights into this too. We were owned by the New York Times up until just very recently, and they were willing to bankroll good journalism in Boston. And although our previous editor Marty Barron had to make some tough choices and he had to close some foreign bureaus, the Boston Globe has been extremely supportive of Washington coverage, and has been dedicated to maintaining a robust presence here, with a bureau that's at 6 is about half the size of what it was 10 years ago, but still quite strong and important, and seen as a very important part of Boston coverage because the nexus between the two cities is so strong, and we're able to make a case for it. I think that's if we had been owned by a chain, say, and I don't want to cast aspersions, but there are a number of chains that have been shrinking their bureaus, and what they do is they put all the reporters into one large bureau, and then people are expected to cover a couple of states for that chain, and that's how the Washington bureaus have been consolidated over the years. We're very hopeful and very pleased that John Henry bought us, and we're expecting to maintain the same size going in the future. It's rare. My predecessor, I used the phrase "last Mohicans." That was actually my predecessor who used that phrase, and it's really kind of true about our bureau. It's a sad situation. There used to be so many bureaus just like ours, Louisville and St. Louis, and all around the country there were bureaus of our size that here competing for news. I think the erosion of competition is one of the real shames of this trend. As far as the new model, I don't know. You see what is growing are Politico and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. These are the new models. They do a great job, and they break a tremendous amount of news. You don't see too many projects like the one we just completed, and so I'm happy we're still around. I'd let Michael and maybe Carolyn talk about this as well. Michael did the piece on the media that we've been discussing.
Thanks, Chris. The Globe has this great tradition going back, for many decades of being an independent bureau, not being part of a chain. And when I applied to the Boston Globe many years ago, actually I was thinking about that at the time. I used to work for what was then the Knight Ridder chain. And I thought about, do I want to go to a paper that's part of a chain? We'll have one or two people really tied to the paper, because I had heard even way back then, and I've known Finley for a long time. He and I covered the White House together some years ago. And I was concerned even then about that they would say, well, we get most of this elsewhere. So the key to Washington coverage for the Globe has always been trying to find distinctive stories that you just wouldn't get elsewhere, that if we're simply replicating. And in the days before the internet and CNN, it was important, and I benefited from being able to cover the White House and travel all over the world with whoever was president. But you at a certain point became redundant if you were simply reporting what was out there, very widely available. So even from the beginning, we've always tried to find those stories that our readers simply wouldn't get elsewhere, and that's always been the mantra. That doesn't mean that it has to be just about local matters. We cover those as best we can and better than anybody else, but it also means what can we bring that someone else wouldn't bring. So some of these stories, I think most of them in the Broken City series, weren't Massachusetts-centric per se, but our belief has always been that, for example, the readers in Massachusetts and New England have this great interest in politics. Maybe not as much as in sports, but close. And that has always been the key. If your bureau represents an area that there's just not this intrinsic interest. So we've had this incredible run, just as an example, of Massachusetts politicians running for president, Michael Dukakis, John Kerry, Mitt Romney, and in the latter two cases, the Globe ended up doing books about them because there's just so much interest. So it just is part that we're lucky that there's this incredible political tradition in Massachusetts of intense interest in national politics and local politics, and we've benefited from that, and that every editor I've ever talked to has said that's the reason that we need to maintain a strong Washington bureau. You can't look at revenue numbers and say, aha, the bureau is bringing in X number of dollars. It's just part of what readers have come to expect from, and the one, Chris mentioned this, we did have to cut the foreign bureaus. At the time, the New York Times owned us, and we could use their foreign bureaus, and we couldn't argue that we were going to cover, a foreign capital better than the New York Times, and so it was a basic decision on that. But we could argue that we're going to cover Washington in ways that we just wouldn't get elsewhere. So that's, I shudder to think that there are many members of Congress today who I don't think have to worry about a Washington bureau covering what they do. I think a lot of the coverage that I see from some obscure member from somewhere might be they put out a press release and it's reported and picked up by people who've never set foot in Washington.
Well, I would just tell you that, again, when I entered Congress, the Wichita Eagle had a full-time representative here in Washington and covered me and the delegation around me very closely. It had a profound influence on me because I knew somebody was watching. And now, in many respects, members are much more anonymous to the, what I call general media. Nobody knows what they're doing, or they only know what the member tells them what they're doing. And so it's a different
Dan, when I was elected, the Dallas Morning News had a very significant bureau here. It almost doesn't exist now.
Yeah.
And this is a major regional newspaper.
Yeah. So that's the other comment I want to just what Norm said. And I don't know how the other members talk, but I had a district that was substantially white, but it was, I'd say, about 80% white and about 10% Hispanic and about 7% African American. But the diversity of the district became very, very cognizant in my mind. I had to think about all these different groups all the time, and I couldn't go down the ideological road, or it would have an impact on my base. And that is something that's really important for a member to represent his or whole district. And I think that is an excellent point that you made, and that's a reason for how redistricting changes can impact thinking, policy, how the country runs, and all those kinds of things. I don't know if you had that kind of impact or not.
Well, I did, and I think going back to Chris's earlier point about climate change, I was one of the handful of Republicans who voted for climate change legislation. It fit my district perfectly, and the reason I bring this up is because although it was good in California and Southern California, and California had a regime or a bill that was stronger than the federal bill, I was trashed by the national media. And so the national media not knowing about my district or caring about my district, yet the backlash I received was from Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and those. And so that influenced my thinking in the future, perhaps. I sort of had scars on my back, not brought upon me by my own district, but by the national media. And so that was probably an example, I guess, of this. So hope that helps.
So the floor.
I have essentially three. The first is I slightly disagree with Representative Coyne. The Democratic Party has not moved very much left. What's happened is they've lost the blue dogs. I think Jim Cooper may end up to be the only blue dog left after this next election. The real problem lies with the Republican right. At this point, they're the ones that are driving the dialogue. They're the ones that are making it almost impossible to have constructive legislation. And I've written about this myself, which is essentially to say it's the Republicans that have to do something about that. And they have to do it on a level that goes down to state legislatures because the Tea Party bench is large. The second thing I think is needed is to get away from caucuses and conventions. Caucuses and conventions invite the extremes, to make the decisions. If you go to primaries, the extremes won't. Or at least the others than the extremes have a much better chance. And the last thing I want to raise is totally outlandish, but it's the way, to deal with the problem of participation at the polls. We have 61 million eligible American citizens who can't vote. We have 20 million names on registration lists that are invalid. And the only way to deal with that is a national biometric ID, because that would automatically enfranchise the 61 million. It would get rid of the 20 million invalid names, and it would get rid of the biennial debate about fraud, suppression, and intimidation. Now, that's a hard thing to get done, because of concerns about privacy. But it would do so much for not only that part of our society, but for several others. I don't think so.
Well, I agreed with 2 out of 3 of the things you said. And the first one, though, of course, I think, and then I don't want to turn this into anything like a partisan discussion, but I will relate that when I first ran into Congress, I enjoyed going to speak before the Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Bucks County Education Association. And the teachers' community there, I mean, it wasn't, it was obviously mostly Democratic, but it was probably 30% Republican, and it was open to a lot of Republican ideas back then. And there are many, many Democratic constituencies today that have become more orthodoxy driven. And I think probably the teachers union is the best example of that, where you have many Democrats who, like our governor in Pennsylvania, Democratic governor, who was in favor of school choice, and the Democratic orthodoxy came out against him as ruthlessly as any of the Tea Party folks have come out against Republicans who stray from the orthodoxy. And I think when you look at issues like entitlement reform, especially, and we haven't even heard that word here today, but much of that is driving our divide in America today, because entitlement reform brings demographic challenges together, brings generational challenges together at a time, and it has become the elephant in the room in many political realities that people just don't want to discuss. And I guarantee you there are whole wings of the Democratic Party who, if you even mention moving an inch away from the current gold standard entitlement vision that they have for their party, they will bring candidates against those Democrats in the same way that the Tea Party folks are worried about it on their side. So I think it's unfair to portray the gridlock in America solely on the backs of the Republicans. I think it is really a bipartisan problem, and you're only going to solve it by looking at it as a bipartisan problem. Anyone who defines this problem as just a Republican problem is basically saying, we're not going to fix this problem, because that brings so many in the Republican Party automatically against reasonable solutions for it. It's got to be looked at as a bipartisan solution, and I really don't like it when I hear people say this is just a Tea Party or Republican Party that has to be fixed.
Well, we have some congressional staff. I wonder, I didn't mean to pick on you guys, but we have 2 of them. Is that right? 3. Okay. Well, I mean,
And Mike Capuano's guy too.
okay, all right, you folks are in the system right now. I wonder if you have any comments on what you've heard. Those of you who have to deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, well, I think coming from the House Democrats right now, the minority, obviously one of our favorite talking points this past year is that, well, we may be the minority, but we actually got 1 million more votes nationwide than the House Republicans. So a lot of the ideas I'm hearing about redistricting reform, I think many on our side of the aisle would be pretty supportive of. One idea that I would be interested to, and I just want to say that I like how you guys, the reporters, you all went to different areas of the country and looked at what was working and what wasn't working and schemes out there. And I think maybe for considering doing a follow-up, going to some other countries and looking at what they're doing too, because we've heard about the German system, things like that. But because one that I think yes. Yes. One particular idea that I know they do in Australia is they have mandatory voting. And if we're talking about expanding our voter base, we can do things like, the voter suppression that's been such a hot topic recently. But if we actually required people to vote, maybe you'd get some of that, 50% of self-identified centrists who maybe aren't the people who are now watching the nightly news anymore. They're one of the ones who are watching ESPN and don't necessarily view politics as a sport. But if you're going to have to pay a fine or go to the polls, we might get some more moderate voices out there. So just a thought.
We did mention that, and just for informational purposes, and I didn't go to Australia for this, but in Australia there is mandatory voting. You can provide a note or an excuse as to why you can't vote, but the bottom line is they had a 92% voter participation rate in the most recent election that I read about, and if you don't vote, the fine is something like the equivalent of $19 American. So, there are people here who object to that. It'd be way different than the biometric that Curtis Scans mentioned, but this is done, variations of this are done around the world in different ways to spur more voting.
And Australia hasn't had a recession in about 50 years, too, so they're doing something right.
Any other congressional? You work where?
I work at Levick, which is a communications firm, but I've done press and communications on the Hill for some time, so coming more from the communications angle than the policy angle, one of the things that interested me was the article about the culture of distortion, for example, saying that PETA kills animals, which is technically, I guess, accurate, but it's and how do you think the solution? The Humane Society, yeah. My apologies.
No, I think he quoted it correctly, actually.
No.
They went after, I do with that story, they went after the Humane Society, and also they go after PETA.
Right.
Yeah.
So, one of the things coming from campaign communications is I was part of the culture of distortion. I guess, so blame me. I'm part of the broken Washington. But how do you, and I kind of took pride in that whenever I was doing it, of taking a thread of truth and completely distorting it and blowing it out of control. So how do you, so if the culture is that, and I admit it, if the culture is that the ends justify the means, which is what I always told myself, is there a solution to that issue?
I'll just tell you, coming off one of the more competitive, before I moved to Washington fairly recently, I spent the year before covering the Scott Brown, Elizabeth Warren Senate race, which was $80 million spent, and it's definitely one of the most competitive in the country. And
You going to New Hampshire next week?
yeah, we might be headed to New Hampshire. But I think the Globe considered, one of the key things we had to do, and probably more intensely than any election that I've been involved in, was just constant fact-checking. And we didn't call ourselves a fact-checking organization, but it was just there was so much stuff flying. And I think you're right, and I think that goes back to that resources issue before. The Globe was willing and able to devote those kind of resources. Other papers that I've worked for in the past, including, the Miami Herald, a pretty similar kind of size community that it covers with even dirtier politics, since when I was there and since I've left, they've just completely shrunk the staff. I think we're lucky to have more fact-checking organizations that do it nationally now, because that even helped us in the Brown-Warren race when there were some things that were so deeply in the weeds and we had to figure out on deadline whether they were true. And a lot of them, luckily, were recycled claims that the parties had made nationally, so you could just see that, a similar claim was made. But the bigger question, or one of the bigger questions, of course, is there is so much out there, and people choose what they want to believe, and there will be a large segment of people that won't look to the sort of legacy organizations like us that are willing and able and interested in spending the time and putting these kind of stories out there, and they will just go to the Twitter feed or the blog that, will give them their version of the truth. And that's a problem that I haven't figured out how to overcome. I don't think any of us has.
I was just going to make a point, because this was something that I found in looking at the think tank community in Washington, which is obviously, presumably, smart people trying to figure out what are the facts, and then from the facts proposing potential solutions. And I guess I wonder if what you're describing, this distortion, is just really a byproduct of some of the more fundamental things we're talking about. In other words, if you're so polarized and you're so playing to the extremes, everyone knows that you need to come up with facts to support your point of view. And what I found, and I talked to lots of people in the think tank community who would readily acknowledge this, not always on the record, but that was this enormous pressure from sort of the top down that, okay, this is what we want the solution to be. So go back and figure out effectively how do you most make that case based on the facts. So I think the distortion is very much a problem, but I think it's in some ways it's a symptom of this larger illness.
Yeah, Jim.
I'm interested in moving the discussion a little bit to solutions, and a lot of, a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, oh, it's broken, and cry and just sort of say, well, we'll have to wait till another election before it gets fixed. But there's some things that have happened in Congress that can be changed and bring us back to an era of more compromise. One of the things that I'm been thinking a lot about is so-called regular order. The processes that exist within Congress itself that almost demand people to be aware and supportive of the purposes of compromise. And if there's anything that seems to have had a deleterious effect, in my mind, it's the continuing resolution, where it has given the whole legislative process a kick the can down the street permanence. And we've got to do something to get away from that kick the can mentality. And the regular order that we used to have would force people to say, okay, we've got to have these appropriation bills out. They're going to come out by the end of December. We've got to have the authorizing committees have got to do their work. The markups have got to take place in such a structure. I mean, maybe it's wishful thinking, but to me, I'd love to see us get back to, in some way, both parties agreeing that to get to a regular order process would be advantageous.
Let's see, Mary, you wanted to ask a couple, and we'll get to you, Dan.
I wanted to ask Martin and Norm, since you're sitting together, something that I've thought of. There used to be an unspoken rule in Congress that you didn't campaign against your delegation, your state delegation, because you knew you had to work together on issues of importance to your state. But that rule's been changed. It was an unwritten rule. But now we campaign against one another, and quite ferociously too, I might add. Members of Congress raise money also from one another. So you'll be trying to work with somebody on your committee who's donating money to your opponent, and it causes a real breakdown. So my question out of both of you, and Martin, you ran, the DCCC, so but is there something there to sort of get the Congress so that they campaign against one another? Because it is, believe it or not, it is a very personal institution. It's a very emotional institution, and these things matter. Is there a way to do that?
I'll start.
It used to be the case when I was first elected in Texas that we didn't campaign against each other, either in primaries or on people in the other party. That changed when we had an influx. The state became much more competitive. We had an influx of Republicans in the early 80s in our district, and everything kind of went by the boards, and you couldn't enforce that in any way because they were anxious to increase the Republican representation in our state, and they felt that they had been denied for a long period of time and that they had to beat some of us, which they ultimately did. So I'm not sure you can go back to that kind of situation. It was a different era, a different time. In terms of what the party committees could do, the party committees are there to get to a majority. And you couldn't look to either the NRCC or to the DCCC to try and impose that kind of standard because it's just too much is at stake. And the party, and you don't have a large margin, even though the redistricting process is unfavorable to the Democrats right now. The Republicans don't have a real large margin in the House. And this could be a very interesting election year before it's over. So I'm not sure you can get back to that kind of situation. But I'm curious because no one else has responded to the comment that I made at the beginning about how you change the money situation, because that's what's so fundamental to all this. And Curtis has looked at this, I know, over the years, and other people have too, all kinds of creative solutions to try and get around what the Supreme Court has done, and all of those have been unsuccessful. And somehow, the problem is because members spend so much of their time raising money that it detracts from their ability to function. And it's not the Warren Brown situation where you have mutually assured destruction where both parties can raise enormous amounts of money and it doesn't tilt to one party or the other. You do have a lot of situations where members can raise a tremendous amount of money, and there's nothing that restrains that in the current system, and it makes districts much less competitive. But no one has commented about that around the table.
Let's get Norm to respond to
Yeah,
Mary's question.
first, Mary, some of this is an artifact of the rise of the permanent campaign, and I think is a terrible destructive element. It probably reached its peak when Bill Frist went into South Dakota to campaign against Tom Daschle. If Daschle had won that race, imagine how poisonous the relations would have been between the two leaders. But you would just never do something like that in the past. But it's also, if you look at the other elements of this that Martin was alluding to, where people now have to raise money for their own campaigns and raise money for the team. And now, one of the worst elements, and if I could change one thing in the money system, actually right now, realistically, it would be to eliminate leadership PACs.
Absolutely.
These are a cancer on the system, and the fact is now you get committee chairmanships and ranking memberships selected not because these are the best people to do these things, but because they have the best fundraising record or the capacity to raise money. All of this has been a terrible element of the system. You could informally begin to change some of that if the parties would agree to it. And, you know, let's face it, when you did get in the Massachusetts Senate race an agreement that really did keep out some of that outside money, it made a difference. Because one of the other things that happens now is you can play good cop, bad cop, too, even within your own area, while getting all the outside people coming in and doing these horrible things. And so we may have to find informal mechanisms. But if you look at the leadership PACs, including the fact that there's no limit on what you can use to spend that money on. You can spend it on a Ferrari if you want for yourself. It doesn't have the same rules that you have with other political fundraising. And then you look at how it's used to create divisions within the Congress. It's a terrible part of the problem.
Okay, we have these two gentlemen down there. We're going to try to break by 1:30, so we'll get everybody.
Okay. I'm Jason. Should I try this? Okay. I'm Jason Stern. I'm CEO of Brady Communications. I work with several small business associations. It has an outreach of about 2.2 million companies. American Chamber of Commerce executives, small business development centers, several other groups. The point I'm going to try to make in order to break what Congress and the President have been doing, to Jim's point right now, we've got to come up with solutions. If you re-engineer some of this, maybe some of the association presidents of these associations can really be good sources to really try to make great suggestions. The NAM and the Business Roundtable all have their traction over in the Congress, but major associations that deal with small business don't. They only represent about 28 million. My point to this whole thing, if you're going to bridge the gap of what the public thinks out there, you need to talk to those who are affected, those who hire people, those who have to pay the health care bills. And I don't think Congress could do, I'll put it like this, they could be paying a lot more attention to the media if you wrote more stories about it and covered what they really think, not going to a company that just emerged and was very successful. That's not the whole way to do it. And my way is go to these 7, 8 presidents. I'm not talking about the U.S. Chamber, but several of these groups, have them meet with them every month, find out what's on their minds, and seeing how you can take corrective action. And so that's some of my points.
Yes, I think Dennis, right here.
Yeah, a couple things. One is that you've sort of been, well, let me just say, Paul Ryan and Patty Murray had one thing in common: neither is a member of their leadership. And the polarization seems to me has coincided. Oh, sorry. The polarization seems to me has coincided also with efforts to centralize within the institution. Gingrich, in particular, was sort of the first effort. He was not going to brook any competing centers of power. He had a complaint about fiefdoms having been built up in the committees, and that model is sort of continued. And there is very much a money component to that in the rise of leadership PACs. And I think that Norm Ornstein said it very well, which we have parliamentary parties, but not necessarily a system. I mean, both parties have interests within the party that exercise a veto power. You mentioned entitlements on the Republican side, obviously, the tax issue, but you've seen more and more on, for example, energy and environmental issues. There used to be Democrats who represented oil and energy-producing areas of the country, many of them in Texas. And those people have been largely weeded out as well. Those used to be regional rather than partisan considerations. And then, the other thing that just, centralization obviously will produce a degree of orthodoxy, but it seems to me that many of the solutions, we could get stuck in a discussion of many solutions as to whether they're chicken or egg. But I think that the key is to just sort of break that constantly reinforcing loop at some point and see what happens.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because we actually did discuss in the Bureau a bit, and we ended up not doing a story, but about the consolidation of power and leadership. And I'm wondering what you think of, are there some concrete rule changes or what could give some power back to committees? But also following up on what Norm was talking about as well, now that the leaderships have the super PACs, it's not just leadership PACs, but now there's a Senate Majority PAC, and each of the party leaderships now have super PACs that can accept unlimited donations. And if you look, some people are kicking in $100,000 at a time into these things. So to me, and it'll be really interesting to see in 2014 how much those leadership controlled super PACs play a role.
Thank you. I also worked on the Hill, so this is a little foursome here. I was at the Senate Armed Services Committee for 5 years, and then I was at the Congressional Budget Office. I was in there in the 70s, almost the whole 70s, and as Norm has written about and all, this kind of behavior would have not been acceptable. It just simply wouldn't have happened. But what I was going to comment on is the role of leadership, especially since we're at the Aspen Institute. And there are good ideas like this association idea and other things, but where's the leadership? And I'm not talking about the congressional leadership, but the leadership of the wise people or people who aren't running for president, but where compromise and moderation becomes a good thing rather than a bad thing. Because as I go around the country, as we all do, you talk to people and you think this person's a Republican and this person really turns out to be center of the road, wanting to just make things work better. So how do we appeal to that kind of thing and get the conversation more positive, as well as these systemic changes? But I'm really interested in how that could happen.
Separation of power is really an important part of the equation.
Yeah, Dan, who
It's not a congressional thing.
Dan,
The leadership of a president can, in fact, make a big difference.
Can
who would you say is our compromiser in chief right now?
Pardon?
Who's our compromiser in chief right now? Because in the past, the president has had a role in fostering compromise dramatically. I mean, it has been a major achievement of many presidents, and I wonder whether there's a reason why that question, that title never really is given to our current president.
If I could jump in and introduce Matt on this, because one of the things we realized as we did Broken City was that a lot of the blame was being pointed towards the Tea Party and extremism on the right. But we did assign Matt to jump in on and look at the chief executive and find out whether or not he was living up to his promises to be a purple president.
Yeah, so I looked at Obama, and both substantively and stylistically, the ways in which he's been unable to deliver on what really was the fundamental theme of his rise in politics, dating to his convention speech in Boston in 2004. And so I looked at it from a series of different ways. One was the meetings that he has. He didn't meet with John Boehner until 2.5 years into his presidency, one-on-one. Boehner came over for the congressional luau and, all these things at the White House, but there wasn't that substantive, meeting between the two of them, even after Boehner was the speaker. And only one time could I find where Obama and Mitch McConnell have been alone in a room together. Even now, 5 years into his presidency, he visits the blue states 6 times more than he visits the red states. And even David Axelrod was saying to me that this was the one disappointment. They've just been unable to pick that lock. And part of that is the Republicans' fault, too. I mean, they vowed to oppose him at every turn, but he's been unable to overcome that. The other thing I looked at was his golfing. Not the time that he spends on the golf course, but who he spends it with. And he'd been golfing. When we did the story, I think it was around 160 times he'd been on the golf course, and only 4 instances was a politician with him. So I think part of it is his style. He doesn't socialize. He doesn't enjoy that kind of atmosphere. But I think that has contributed to and made it unable from a chief executive standpoint to push through the morass in Washington.
Yeah, but I have to say, I think this theme, which Bob Woodward has popularized more than anybody else, if only he schmoozed, if only he were like Lyndon Johnson, is just utter nonsense. The fact is, if Lyndon Johnson were here today, he wouldn't be Lyndon Johnson. And we know from Robert Draper's reporting that on Inauguration Eve of 2009, we had a group of Republican leaders get together and decide that no matter what, they were going to vote against everything in unison of what he wanted.
Yeah.
So, this is not an equivalent problem here. I think his big mistake in not schmoozing with members of Congress came from his own party, because when you begin to falter as a second-term president, you want to have a little bit of a cushion there, and he has no cushion. That's a mistake on his part. But the idea that Mitch McConnell would have said, well, all right, my number one goal is not going to be to make you a one-term president because you met with me numerous times, forget about it.
Let's see. He's had his card up for a while, so yeah, I can't see your name.
Tony.
Tony.
Okay. One of the problems that a lot of people have raised is that there almost seems to be two asks at the same time. On one hand, you have people calling for regular order. On the other hand, it almost seems like the same people applaud a bipartisan budget compromise that was hammered out behind closed doors and then just brought to the floor. No regular order on that. And legislation calling for that, demanding that, came during a government shutdown. And then you also have a situation where there's more money in politics. People are complaining about the way that the redistricting lines are drawn and looking at best ways to redo the lines to have an outcome that would benefit the American people. One thing that isn't talked about that seems like it could almost fix both the money problem and the representation problem is to look at the size of the Congress. We haven't looked at the number of representatives, and it's one of those ideas that usually just gets pushed out of hand as not doable at all. But to me, it almost seems like the country's growing. Mr. Glickman, I was at a lunch earlier this year that you hosted, where you talked about just the mail that you received back then, how dramatically increased it is now, and at the way that trade associations operate, that you would try to have a scorecard in the 70s or the 80s. And now we have large growth of trade associations. We have constituents who are able to access us through email that we then have to respond to. That takes a lot of time. That would probably take a lot of the 9 to 5 if the member was in the office all the time to respond to those with us. But just wanted to see what you guys thought about increasing the size of the House of Representatives at the very least, if not both the House and the Senate.
So was probably going to respond to Norman. I didn't plan it that he was going to go to the men's room so now I can say what I want. But just a couple of broad themes which I agree with, and some things I think I put a different emphasis on. One, there are these deep cultural differences which make some structural reform hard to do, or sometimes people get, I think, too excited about some of the structural reforms when the people are relatively polarized. There are some complications in that statement that you can look around and see that there are some more moderate views in the middle, but many of these independents who call themselves independents are really closet Republicans, closet Democrats. They take cues very strongly from media, from poll questions. So really it's a very deep problem where the structural problems are hard to deal with. The other thing I was going to say is Norman and I are both political scientists, and I agree with him that political scientists are also much too negative. Everything, there's no cause of polarization. There are no fixes. Everything has some sort of unintended consequence. But I guess to go down a few of them on the redistricting point. I mean, I thought it was interesting you went to Iowa, but we might be interested in redistricting reform without thinking it's going to reform the world. I mean, I think a lot of the evidence is it's not going to dramatically change the polarization in America. but there are some other good reasons for doing it. I mean, the main one being that, you know, a lot of places people feel it's wrong that one party sticks it to the other. I mean, that seems sort of, one party decides where the lines are, and the other party has to sort of take it. And the different commissions that are out there, Iowa being one, California another, have different looks to them. And I know Congressman Bono brought up the issue that, you know, some of these seemingly nonpartisan commissions can actually either in reality or perception have kind of a tendency behind the scenes that one party takes it over, or it's rigged for one party. The Iowa model, and actually some of the other commissions out there, which are more bipartisan, don't fall to that problem. And there's some other issues, you know, both parties defending all their incumbents and wanting to, you know, preserve the status quo. But in terms of wanting buy-in from both parties, and a good reason to do redistricting itself might be just, hey, you want to get away from the idea that one party every 10 years has the ability to stick it to the other. And so some of these models like Iowa or Washington State, which has bipartisan, might be like that.
The Iowa one is interesting because it sprang forth when Republicans who were actually in control were afraid they were going to lose the next election. So they're proposing it out of a self-preservation, and the Democrats agreed because they thought there was a chance they could lose. Then when there have been times when the other party have, you know, held majority of all three branches of the government, and they said, you know, wouldn't it be great if we had control of redistricting? But then ultimately they realized, because Iowa is such a swing state, that just because they get it for 10 years, next time they could lose. This seemed to be the most fair way to do it in Iowa. And in North Carolina, the Republicans stuck it to the Democrats, who did it to them 10 years before, many years before.
Sure. I mean, and that's why I think that, look, the places where you might have redistricting reform are really two types. I mean, one where, you know, California and Arizona, which is sort of like California's commission, where the minority party wants it for self-interest, and the majority party usually go to a referendum, and the people say, okay, we'll take it out of the politicians' hands. But the other model is, as you say, places that are close or places that don't want the courts to take over, the legislature wants to be part of it, and they, you know, both parties say, hey, we both want to be a part of it. Again, it does have some downside because, you know, you could end up with both parties just defending their own, but it does get away from this big problem, which I think, you know, people perceive. The other thing is on the, I guess two other things on the primaries side. Again, I mean, I was praising you and criticizing you while you were gone, Norm. But the primaries, the political scientists will tell you that if you opened up primary turnout, it probably isn't going to look so much different than the people who are showing up at the primaries today. Because even these independents who might show up still are kind of partisan in their own way. But I think, you know, there's a real incentive for the parties to sort of stop being lazy, to get involved in primaries, or to increase primary turnout, to move away from conventions and caucuses, really small turnout things, because, I mean, you want these institutions of the parties to be invested in our system and not just allow groups and other interests to push them around. And so, you know, one good reason for just trying to broadly increase turnout is not so much that it's going to, you know, change the outcomes so much, but it really is to just get the parties, you know, much more involved in lots of aspects of politics. And on the top two, I do think the one potential problem for it, and, you know, there are all sorts of versions of it in fair votes, is that people have a really hard time distinguishing between two different Republicans or two different Democrats in these systems. They don't see the party cues. They don't know how to vote. One sort of very disturbing piece of data that came out of the first round was in a lot of these races where there are two people of the same party, two Democrats running against each other, two Republicans, most of the voters of the other party, they abstain. They show up at the polling booth, they look, and they say, oh, there are two Democrats on the ballot. I don't know who to vote for. I won't vote at all. So I don't know how we get around that, but it is a problem that the people still are kind of polarized by party. And then finally, the last thing on just broad participation. Again, I think it would be a good thing, more investment in the system, more investment of these institutions, more investment in the parties. And I think there probably would be some slight change in the types of people who showed up. But, you know, I don't think we should exaggerate that it would be this, you know, I think sometimes people think, you know, it would benefit one party very, very strongly or have a big different set of outcomes. I'm not sure that that's the case, but having a kind of greater investment of the parties and others because of the participation makes some sense.
Okay, we're going to end with you and then close up.
Okay. I'd just like to talk a little bit more about the preference voting, ranked choice voting idea that Norm mentioned, and why Fair Vote thinks it's potentially really important, perhaps even would have even more significant effects than the California model of independent redistricting and top two. There was just an election in Minneapolis last month that used ranked choice voting. And one of the very interesting things that we saw in this election was that all the major candidates, the tone of the campaign was very different because they needed to get not just the first choices of their supporters, but also the second choices of their opponents. So because in a ranked choice voting election, when one person loses, their first choice voters default to their second choice. So when you're trying to appeal to other candidates in an election, you're going to get a much more civil tone. You're likely to get a more moderate person who wins, someone with a more majoritarian support. And that can really make a big difference both in the tone of elections and what happens after people are elected. Another thing that we at FairVote really like the idea of is multi-member districts using ranked choice voting, which is obviously somewhat more difficult to achieve, but it could have even more powerful effects. The theory of this is, and this is used in national elections in Ireland and Australia already. If you have a 3-seat district, instead of having a winner-take-all system like we have now, where whoever gets 51% of the votes represents the entire district, if you have a 3-seat district, there's going to be a third on the left who's going to elect a candidate, a third on the right who's going to elect a candidate, and then a third in the center who's also going to elect a candidate. And right now, there's no way for the center to elect people to Congress because in closed party primaries, it's always the voters in Democratic districts, it's the Democratic voters who elect a candidate, and in Republican districts, it's only the Republican voters that elect a candidate. So we think that this sort of plan, which we call fair representation voting, could perhaps have the greatest effects at reducing polarization of all the structural changes that are being talked about.
Very good. Let me just mention just a couple things, and I'll turn to Mary to close. I use this quote all the time, but it was John Maynard Keynes said, "For every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution." And this is not capable of any one thing. It's just it's cultural, it's visceral, a lot of it has to do with our education system over the last 20 or 30 years, not teaching people basic concepts of citizenship. And a lot of it has to do with, I agree with Tom Brokaw and others who said when we ended compulsory military service, it had a lot to do with the concept of service generally. I'm not advocating going back to compulsory service, but Aspen has the Franklin Project, which is based here, which is General Stanley McChrystal and John Bridgeland, who are trying to develop a national service project so we can begin to kind of train the American people to serve and to recognize that others may have different positions, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles, so to speak. Not everybody gets what he wants. But I've heard some very constructive things here and some of the solutions that I hope we can follow up on. And one suggestion to the newspaper, and that is that one of the things that struck me is other institutions are doing quite well. The business world is actually doing pretty well. The faith-based world is actually doing pretty well. The NGO and nonprofit world is doing pretty well. What is it about our political system that's different? What are the disincentives for leadership in our political system that we seem to have in these other systems that are out there, and where leadership does make a difference, where companies with great leaders have impact? And by the way, they're political organizations too. They may not be the same kind, but they got to worry about their constituents and their employee base and everything else. And one of the things that strikes me is principles of leadership and followership really not very well developed in the institution like they were 50 or 100 years ago, where, and it was obviously a lot easier to do it back then. And how can you bring back principles of leadership into our government institutions and do it with all of these problems that we're talking about right now? It just strikes me that you got to also deal with some of these outside human factors in addition to structural factors that we have. And I may not be as clear as I want to be, but I can tell you that a citizenry which is educated and engaged is one of the things that made this country great over the years. And that may be a part we haven't been talking about as much today as we should. Mary?
I would throw in the word ethics.
Well, I don't disagree. I'm glad we have an ethical person here to do that.
You can tell Dan Glickman came from Motion Picture Association before and has that motion picture ability to end us all waiting for the sequel to this conversation. He's leading us into the next one before we've wrapped this one up. But I'll close the way I began and by thanking you, Dan, for leading this, and the Aspen Institute for doing it. I want to thank the Boston Globe for taking on this enormous task and for putting the resources into something that is so critically important. And I, too, think I've heard an awful lot of constructive dialogue, and I want to thank each and every one of you for what you've had to say. I'm around. I'm on Twitter and Facebook if you want to continue these great ideas. Let me know how I can help. But, again, thank you all very much for being here, and happy holidays to everybody.
And the website, the email